She is a treasure trove of telling compelling sports stories, and she's got a pretty fascinating one herself, which we're going to talk about today. It is Emma Baccellieri of Sports Illustrated, predominantly with baseball coverage, but we saw what she did during the women's NCAA tournament when it came to basketball. So she is what I like to call a prodigy in this industry, formerly of Deadspin, and we're going to talk a lot about her interesting journey on this podcast. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor at Fox Sports Radio. Emma, first of all, thank you so much for your time. I know you have 100 things to do right now with baseball in full swing. How do you feel like you set yourself apart in how you tell a story?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you for having me, first of all. Uh, but that's something that I'm constantly asking myself and constantly having different answers to. I think a big one is just, I'm lucky to have the freedom not to be kind of bound really tightly to a day-to-day structure with my job. Like I'm not a beat writer who absolutely needs to have a story about every single game or even a story every day or every week. And so that kind of gives me the freedom to sometimes like really zoom out and think, like, what are the questions that I find the most interesting, that have anything to do with baseball at all? And sometimes those aren't specifically about players. Sometimes that's about the structure of the game. Sometimes it's about, this last year has given us a ton of stories about players' families, about the way that baseball has to work in a pandemic, and all the people who work in baseball who aren't players and managers and coaches and in the front office, because there's a lot of people outside that mold. So I guess a roundabout way of answering that question is just kind of trying to get myself to think kind of outside of the frame of, what's happening on the field, but instead like what is most interesting to me about the way that baseball is working right now, and what would be the best way to go about trying to find someone who has a story to tell about that question or about that problem.
As far as the way in which you write stories, the syntax, I found it interesting that when you left Deadspin, they called you a wry chronicler, and they would go on and go on and go on. How would you characterize the style and the rhythm in how you use words and the melody of sentences to pen the way you want to project stories?
Yeah, that's a very thoughtful question, because yeah, I am someone who I enjoy the writing aspect of writing. I think, I have some friends and colleagues who do great work I really respect, but they love reporting or they love, analysis, but the writing itself isn't their bedrock of what they do. And for me, that really is one of my favorite parts of my job. Um, and so, yeah, that's another thing that I feel lucky about with working at first at Deadspin and now at Sports Illustrated. In both places, there's not a very strict house style. It's not like I have to be like, here is my super factual newspaper style story. There's the freedom to be a little more literary or to get kind of flowery with certain things, or to, kind of indulge in writing more creatively. Um, and I try to do that as much as I can within reason. I have, been conscious of there are limits to that and how much you can go with trying to play things up in that vein. But yeah, I think a lot of it depends on the story and what exactly I'm doing, but I do enjoy the actual act of writing it and not just reporting or analyzing.
If there was a baseball player, and obviously you spend a lot of time covering the game, and few know the game as well as you do, what baseball player has the same sort of demeanor, the candor on the field, as the way you write in your style as a writer? Maybe there's a flash, maybe there's not. What player do you think kind of fits the mold of who you want to be and perceived as a writer?
That's another really good question.
Thank you.
Gonna have to take a second to think on this one. I think I'm gonna go with what I'm aspiring to. I'm not sure if I'm there yet, but what I would like to do is something like a Zach Greinke type, where someone who's clearly very thoughtful about his craft and has been one of the best at it for quite a while, but also is kind of quirky with it, kind of fun, enjoys doing some stuff that's a little sillier. I'm not sure what the sports writing equivalent of an ephus pitch is, but just something that catches you a little off guard, is not quite what you're expecting, but actually works really well, is what I'd like to hit at. So yeah, my sports writing goal personified as a baseball player, I'm going to go with Greinke there.
That's a great answer. Emma Baccellieri is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor at Fox Sports Radio. You went to Duke in Durham, and what professor do you attribute most for your career ascendance?
Yeah, I'm actually, I think, a little different from some people in the field in that I didn't go to J school. And while I was at Duke, I actually didn't do any sports writing at all. I was really involved with the student newspaper, but I was on the news side. I was news editor, and I was then eventually the editor in chief of like the monthly news magazine. Um, but I did have a lot of great professors, majoring in history. A lot of that is writing, analyzing, just knowing how to look at different situations and understand all of the factors that go into making something happen. I think a lot of times people think of history as like just names and dates, and studying history from a broader lens, I think actually helped me quite a bit with baseball writing. So yeah, I was lucky to have lots of fantastic professors, even though I wasn't doing writing or sports writing specifically. But I think if I had to pick one, I had a professor named John Burness who taught a class that I took just as an elective, not to do with history, not to do with writing, or my minor was English. It wasn't that. It was a public policy class that was about the history of the American university as an institution, which is like a very high-minded abstract thing. But I'd had friends who had taken the class and said it was really good. And what it was amazing at was getting you to look at, as a student at a university, you tend to think of it as like, this is where I live, this is my thing, this is the place for, students. But they're so much bigger than that in thinking about how does the university work as like a political actor. It has a hospital, it has all of these different schools that are involved in all these different functions that have nothing to do with undergraduates. It is, incredible amounts of money are at stake in a university. Like, how did the American university basically build itself into something like this out of, only 150 years ago, schools looked nothing like this. um, and that actually has a lot of parallels, I think, to sports, and particularly to baseball, where you might think of it as it's a sports league I enjoy watching. That's about it. There's players, there's managers, you know, that's baseball. But actually, there's incredible political power, incredible money, just so much involved. Real estate, law, public policy, like that's all baked into baseball. The same way it's all baked into a university. Like these institutions that we are emotionally attached to, and we think of primarily as, you know, through our own personal connections to them, have so much more going on. And so just having a class that encouraged me to think critically about that, and to just to look for something like that, I think is something that has served me well in sports, certainly. And really just inviting me to think in that sense in general was huge. And so he was a fantastic professor.
When did you feel for the first time that you knew that you were gifted as a writer?
Oh, well, that's generous of you to say. Thank you. I, I'm not sure if I've ever felt like that. Like I said, I enjoy writing, um, and I always appreciate compliments, and I feel very lucky that I've been able to make a career at it. But I think it's just something where realizing I really enjoyed it was the biggest thing for me, which was, I'd liked writing growing up. I had always enjoyed doing it in school. Wrote a little for fun, like middle school, high school. But then when I got to college and started doing the student paper and realized, this is super fulfilling to me as an activity. Like I'm not in J school, I'm not a major or minor, I'm not doing this academically at all. I'm just doing this because I love it. And um, letting that take up more and more of my time slowly, and then deciding like this is actually what I want to do. I think that was the moment for me that made it clear, like, oh, this should be something you should pursue. Just realizing you really, really do like this, and so that was it for me.
And as your career has skyrocketed, what do you enjoy most about this recognition that you're getting?
Um, I mean, I think the big thing is just I'm still just so honored to know that people are reading what I'm writing. Like just anytime I get any sort of feedback at all, even just from someone on Twitter, from someone who reaches out to send me an email, it's just such an honor to know that people are paying attention, and that even if it's just a few people, that anyone is reading this, and that it's either teaching people something or bringing them joy or entertaining them for a little bit, like that does mean a lot to me, and I try not to take that for granted, and realize that it's, you know, a privilege to be able to write like that and to have a platform to say things, and a bigger privilege to have people read it and feel something about it.
What's the one story you wish you could rewrite?
Oh, that's a great question. Um,
It could go all the way back to when you were in college or before then, at any time in your life.
yeah. Let's see. I try not to be to look back too hard because I can be
Yeah.
very self-critical and like try to set some boundaries so I'm not like constantly tearing myself apart. Um, I think one that I loved writing and I'm still really grateful I had the chance to do was a story I did, I guess, 3 years ago now about a woman who was a chess player in the 1960s and was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And I did this whole big thing on her life. And she was in her 80s at the time, like kind of looking back and, you know, what she had done and how she had, you know, lived her life through chess and after chess. But I'd come to that story because I was doing a different story on women in chess at the time, like in 2018. Um, and I just kind of stumbled into her, and I ended up making her a big part of the story because her legacy with Sports Illustrated was so interesting. Not to mention her legacy for women in chess in general. And I kind of wish that's when I would have separated out into, like, there is a fascinating story about this woman, Lisa Lane, and there's also a fascinating story about what women in chess are doing right now to try to kind of like improve their conditions and get more publicity. And those are two separate stories. Like the history is interesting and it has a role in them, but I wish I would have um like recognized at the time, like I don't have to fit everything into one story. Like it's okay to break a big subject like that into two things, because I ended up being, you know, fairly happy with the way it worked out, and I loved reporting it out. But I think that's one that I love that story so much, and I feel like it would have been better served as two stories I love so much rather than combining them into one.
Well, I would think that no matter how good it is, just the perfectionist you are, there's always going to be that piece of you that's going to be judgmental. And in a way, that's sort of healthy because you're always in pursuit of getting better and getting better and getting better. What's the one habit that was hardest to break as far as like a crutch as a writer in your come up in the business?
I am a huge rewriter. Like if you give me time with something, I'm gonna go back to it and try to do it over and try to do it over and try to do it over. Which you can kind of do to magazine stories, but you can't do when you're on deadline for game stories, or you know, on deadline period. And that was really hard for me because I'm someone with, I mean, I'll do this with anything, not just writing. Like with, I also love to bake, and I'm big with this as well. Just like I want it to be absolutely perfect, and I will take all of the time I have allotted to try to get it there, which is not super healthy in general, just for like working as a person. But yeah, I think especially with writing, also you can sometimes like tell if there's too much effort put into something, like it's showing how hard it's working, and that's not usually what I want to show. And so letting myself just leave something and understanding like, I mean, it still has an editor go to. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect right now. But also it doesn't have to be 100% perfect, period. Like it's okay if it's not like the absolute best lead you've ever written. Like don't get so hung up on how it's going to start or how it's going to end. Like you can just leave something and keep moving with it. Um, that is something I'm still very much working on. I wouldn't say I've necessarily learned that lesson, but a lesson I am trying to get through to myself. That's a big one.
Who taught you or where did you learn that pursuit of perfection that you strive for as you talk about in your writing?
Uh, you know, I think that's really just something that I kind of have always had. Like even as a little kid, I remember being very particular about everything basically. Um, and so yeah, I think I had that in school. I think I had that in college at the student paper when I was first setting up to start writing. And then now into, you know, my work as an adult. Which I think is not necessarily a bad thing. I know obviously lots of people have perfectionist impulses and can be a really good thing to be driven to try to get everything exactly where you want it. So in some cases, that is helpful that I have part of me that is kind of always pushing for, everything to be the best it can be, but just knowing where to kind of curb it and when I need to walk away from something or move on to something, the next thing is a big part of it as well.
Emma Baccellieri is with us, does baseball coverage and beyond with Sports Illustrated. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor at FSR. Emma, when do you find yourself the most competitive at your craft?
Oh, also a good question. I kind of going back to what I just said, it is definitely not. I never am one of those writers who's like the first to leave the press box. Like I know that about myself, that I'm always going to take a while to file, and if anything, I try not to be the last to leave the press box. So not on speed for sure. Um, I can get competitive when it comes to I don't like getting scooped, which I'm not like a big news person. I do more features and um, you know, analytical things. So not a lot of, trying to race someone to transaction news or what have you. But when I do have something, I definitely feel very protective of it. And, because it's so rare for me to have a scoop or breaking news, I definitely feel a drive there to be, um, if not first, best, which means more to me than first. But that's certainly one area where I can get super competitive about on the rare occasion I do have something.
Yeah, I can see that. You don't want to be the first person that I didn't realize there's such a judgment to, oh, so and so left the press box first. They must have not done this to their story, or why is that person taking so long? I mean, these are interesting stories that those who are not in that actual realm of sports writing would not ponder about. What is an unwritten part of your story that one day you want people to know about?
Yeah. Um, You're asking a lot of good questions. Sorry, taking a second to try to kind of think about it. I'm not sure if I have that much that's unwritten and that I'm kind of pretty open about, who I am on social media, with colleagues, and so on. But I think one part that I think is sometimes important to talk about when people are discussing, what it means to be in sports writing, how you get into the industry, all of that. Like, I didn't set out to be a sports writer. Like, I feel very lucky to be where I am, and I love my job, and I've always loved sports. But this wasn't something I planned on, and it wasn't something like it wasn't a goal that I set and then started trying as hard as I could to get there. It was, I was in college, I was writing for the student paper, I was writing news, um, and I thought maybe that's what I'm going to do when I graduate. I did internships in local news and political news, um, and basically just through a couple of really lucky breaks was able to transfer my love of sports, but especially baseball, and my interest there into writing about that instead. And felt very lucky for it. I worked really hard once I was in the position to work hard and get a chance, but it wasn't something that I set out to do originally. And I think so often, you see people who have wanted this their whole life, which is incredible, and have worked so hard to get specifically to where they are today, um, which is great, but also I think sometimes can be a little discouraging for people who want to do this but didn't realize that they wanted to do it until they were in college or already out of college and doing something else. And it is possible to do this if it hasn't been your lifelong dream. Um, you know, if you have the talent and hard work and are in the right place at the right time, it doesn't take having set out on this specific path your entire life. And so that's something that you know, I'm not asked about a ton, but it's true that like this wasn't all I ever wanted to do, and it's still possible to do it even so. And so I think that's an important one to bring out.
Yeah, that's so well said. It's not just, and you brought up luck. You're obviously skilled. You talk about lucky breaks, and I know you're just trying to be humble here, but you obviously have the skill. And then the other part of what you're saying is people arrive at their destinations at different times. They might not get there as fast as somebody else. That doesn't mean they're not going to get there. That just means that they've got to take a longer road. And like you said, when it comes down to the hard work and having the skill, I think over time, you keep at it, good things are going to happen and doors are going to open. Final question for you, Emma. I'm Bryan Fenley. Knowing that you went to Duke, What's the longest you've ever camped out at Cameron Indoor for a basketball game?
I was never one of the like super hardcore
Okay.
intense people. Like they divided into three groups. Basically, it's like black tenting, blue tenting, white tenting. And black tenting are the people who are doing it for like 2 months, which was not me. Like I knew that going in. I like sleeping in a bed. I like being warm. I like Duke basketball, but when it comes down to it, I'm not willing to give up my bed for Duke. So I never did more than I think my sophomore year, I was part of a group that we collectively tented for 2 weeks, but that meant I only had to be out there for I think 5 or 6 nights over those 2 weeks, um, which was worth it. It was a lot of fun, but also like kind of solidified my desire to like this is a cool thing that I'm really glad I did once that I'm not going to do again.
It's funny because so I went to UNC Greensboro. One of my best childhood friends from San Diego, where I'm from, went to Duke. And so we went to college at the same time. And I think it was 2008, 2009. And his roommate at Duke uh, didn't want to go to the game, and Duke was hosting my alma mater, UNC Greensboro. So my friend went to the game, and I used his roommate's ID, and I sat in with the Cameron Crazies, rooting on my own team. But that's like those are kind of moments where you sort of I don't know if I should have said that, but no, I it was it's everybody deserves an opportunity to watch a basketball game at Cameron Indoor, and everybody who calls themselves a sports fan needs to treat themselves to your work as a sports writer, seen on Sports Illustrated. I also loved all the coverage and the advocacy you did for women's basketball during the NCAA tournament. Obviously, there were some big stories that came out of that, and you were right on it. And obviously, discussing things with UCLA women's coach Corey Close, who I've had a chance to talk to, and she's awesome, and you're awesome. And Emma, thank you so much for doing this. I'm Bryan Fenley. Check out Emma's work, Emma Baccellieri, and she will not disappoint. Thanks again, Emma, for your time.
Oh, thank you.